Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. It was an incredibly busy and tiring May in the art world, with auctions in New York spread out all over the month, art fairs in New York also occurring throughout May, and it concluded with Art Basel Hong Kong. With just so much going on in the market, we wanted to chat with a market insider to help us break everything down to see where things stand as we head into June. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we chat with Judd Tully, an independent arts journalist who contributes regularly to ARTnews and the Art newspaper. You can also read all of his writings on his website at juddtully.net. We hope you enjoy the conversation with Judd, and thanks so much for listening. Judd, thanks so much for chatting with us.
Yeah, sure thing, Adam.
So I think a great place to start is in New York City, where it felt like we had major auctions, or at the very least auction previews, going on for almost the entire month. And if we look at things as a whole, it seems the market remained intact and is still very strong. What are your feelings about this, and what were some of the major takeaways from the sales?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the amount of art that was sold between, say, in New York over 2 weeks, and which was interesting in the sense that Christie's was started off with some single owner sale, the Thomas and Doris Amon collection. Then they had the collection of Anne Bass single owner sales. All in over those 2 weeks, the numbers was, considerable. I think it was close to around $2.4 billion in terms of combined day, evening sales. And I guess it just shows that there's a, amazing amount of money in the world to buy art. And especially against the backdrop, at least more recently this month, of the equities markets taking a beating, and it didn't seem to have much of an impact. I thought it was interesting that, and I was going to mention a third single owner sale, and that was the second part of the Maclau trove at Sotheby's. And all in with those two sales from this past November to now, that came to over something like 922 million. Anyway, you can throw out all these numbers. They're huge. That said, it's kind of interesting that there were many instances of high-value works in both contemporary and in the Impressionist modern field that they sold, but they really sold towards the low end of expectations as opposed to the high end or above the high end, where you would see that going on in the various sales of younger artists. Sotheby's Now sale, Phillips, of course, which has always been very big on showing emerging or about to explode secondary market artists, and those were, Sotheby's. They had a white glove sale. And it's sort of hard to correlate in terms of the numbers. I'll give you an example or a couple of examples. Looking again at that Sotheby's evening sale, they call it the Now or Now, N-O-W. And this very young artist, Anna Wyant, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly, It's Weyant. Um, at any rate, she was the lead-off lot in both Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips' evening sale in that specialty group, which it's quite a hat trick. And this is a young artist who recently joined Gagosian, and one of her paintings, Falling Woman, that was estimated at 150 to 200,000, made 1.6 million all in, including buyer's premium. Go figure. But that said, she wasn't alone. There are many young and not young women artists that did phenomenally well during the several weeks. In fact, kind of an unprecedented number. And it's interesting when you see an artist that maybe you're not that familiar with, and I'm not, but Christina Quarles, for instance, her work popped up at Sotheby's, the same sale that I'm talking about, and then I'll stop. But a painting of hers, a recent painting, Night Fell Upon Us, that carried an estimate of 600 to 800,000, made 4.5 million. So you kind of wonder, well, what does that mean? Or like, is every painting that artist makes worth that? No. But you kind of wonder how that huge gap between primary market prices, which sometimes, not always, but sometimes estimates are based on, especially with younger artists that haven't been at auction much or at all, how that correlates with these, prices that are multiple times over the high estimate. And that could be a scary thought or a warning sign or who knows what, but it'll be interesting to see if this carries on through the next couple of seasons.
It's funny you called it a hat trick, a single artist leading off each of the 3 auction house evening sales. I can't recall seeing anything like that in the past. Really, so many of these artists earlier in their careers are achieving results that are rather stunning. What are insiders and veterans of the art market saying about this phenomenon that we're witnessing?
I mean, of course, yeah. It depends, of course, who you talk to. Obviously, there's a lot of speculation going on, and if you want to call them flippers, or I won't say collectors, but people that got in early on a certain artist's career, bought work, and then brought it back to market without going through the gallery, of course. And just to back up for 1 minute, I did want to give credit to a blogger who pointed out the trio of Weyant paintings, and that was Lee Rosenbaum of her blog is called Culture Girl, which is like "gur" with an L. And as she pointed out, and quite astute, that from previous eras of art market, speculation or buoyancy or bull markets, that sometimes, not always, but usually, something happens afterwards that goes in the opposite direction. I mean, it's not like exactly like cryptocurrency, but yet. But I think there, in this whole sort of panorama, there is maybe some cautionary signs. I mean, that excuse me. That said, when a work that's no question fantastic, such as the top lot at the Ann Bass sale, which only had a dozen lots, and that weighed in at like over $360 million. But the Monet Houses of Parliament made close to 76 million. And that was one of the outliers in terms of the estimate was 40 to 60. And it's also interesting that the top price during all of those auctions, various owners, single owners, wound up taking place at Phillips, which has got to be a first for that house. And that was with the huge Basquiat painting from 1982 that made 85 million all in. And that's pretty extraordinary, I would say. And not just because of Phillips being able to get that work, which was untitled, and it was estimate on request, and it was backed by a third party. It was a huge price, and it was being sold. I mean, they announced it that it was the Japanese magnate Mizawa who sold it, and it had a great history going back to being bought by Adam Lindemann at a auction in London, where he paid something like I think it was around £4 million. I don't want to be quoted on that price. Anyway, at the time that was a big price. So I mean, Basquiat is just wow. But at the same time, and again, perhaps this is a note of caution or a note of, well, it's not every Basquiat that comes up, but that Christie's had two major Basquiat works. I mean, a bit unusual in the sense that one of them was, it was a triptych on panel dated 1982, which is the primo year for Basquiat's very short career. A portrait of the artist as a young derelict. And that was an estimate on request. I think it was in the region of maybe 30 million. And that was, I'm sorry, this was two works that were at Christie's, and they were withdrawn before the sale because obviously it seemed there wasn't any interest that Christie's could determine, and I guess wisely withdrew them. The other one was a wood construction that had a lower estimate of 4 to 6 million, C plate 3. So, one has to, look carefully at, what's coming up and what it means and how many there might be. And if it's too aggressive, the market might find it so.
One thing you did mention initially is the softening in the stock market, and there's been increased economic concern outside of the art world, just speaking more generally, with declines in the stock market, increasing inflation, geopolitical risks, of course. Did we see that creep into the auctions in any meaningful way, or has the art market been immune to that thus far?
Well, I mean, it makes great headlines that in, the midst of, bordering on World War III and, the oil crisis, everything, the art market seems this, spectacular, immune creature. But I believe if you were looking at past sort of trends downward in the art market, they tend to react slower than, say, the real estate market. So we'll have to see. I mean, in terms of, I think if you were holding valuable art and you looked at these recent results, you might, seriously consider, putting something great up at auction. You'd probably want some sort of guarantee, which all the houses seem to be, happy to make a deal on. And I mean, it almost seems like, I mean, not a mirage because these numbers are real, but I think the whole auction engine from the pandemic that forced the houses to go live stream, to really bulk up their digital prowess and reach. And I think it's been quite effective in terms of finding new buyers, finding buyers that are not in the sales room, that perhaps never even saw the work that they're bidding on in person, only, seeing it on a screen. I think those are all indicators that, there's certainly depth to the market and certainly new wealth going after, evening sale works. I mean, not to mention day sale, but I mean, if you were actually standing in the sales room, for instance, at Christie's during any one of those evenings, they have these big screens on the, say the back wall with showing, specialists in Hong Kong or London or Paris. And then you're seeing where the bids are coming from online in New Mexico. I mean, it's just like a different sort of presentation and another kind of theater.
Yeah, I think a lot of listeners haven't been to the auction room since before the pandemic, and we watch these sales online, and it looks like a game show almost. Just how much have these rooms transformed in real life?
Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, the live audience in the sales room are quite small. And I mean, maybe 200 people or something like that. And there's so much like overhead heavy lighting equipment and these kind of robotic cameras that can scoot around the room to get different angles. It's I mean, the perfect, I mean, and I'm not criticizing him in any way, shape, or form, but Oliver Barker at Sotheby's he is like the ultimate game show host. I mean, he's just so polished and smooth and effective. And I think, he's gotten a lot of experience in these last 2 years by doing these live stream events. And also in the sales room, but it's very different. You don't get that kind of excitement of people rushing in, getting seats, standing room only. It's very controlled and more antiseptic, I would say.
So I'd like to shift away from New York City for a little bit because there was another major event that occurred in May in the art market, which was Art Basel Hong Kong. And I can't believe it's still the case, but Asia still feels very isolated from the world and, of course, the art world, whether it's auctions or art fairs or any other kind of in-person experience. What did you hear about how that fair went and how strong the Chinese market is at the moment, despite being so physically isolated from everyone else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little difficult. I mean, from my vantage point, because I wasn't there, I wasn't on the ground, so I don't really know. But certainly, the impact, continuing impact of COVID and various, rather draconian lockdowns in terms of ability to travel and attend things like that. I mean, there were. This year at Art Basel Hong Kong, of the 130 stands, galleries, etc., I believe it was 75 were what they refer to as satellite galleries. In other words, the actual dealers or principal directors were not there. which I think is fairly significant. I mean, of course, now anyone can sell, if they know the name of the client, or they can, somehow reach out and, send the JPEG, all the information. They have viewing rooms, virtual viewing rooms, all that. But in terms of, wouldn't you want to sort of be face to face with someone like David Zwirner, or at least one of the directors? And that wasn't the case there. That said, I think the sales were decent, perhaps decent plus, and it's a smaller, footprint now, and it's just a question of, given, the might of mainland China and its impact politically on Hong Kong in terms of, virtually no free press. It's it's not like what it was 5 years ago as this sort of, breathing democratic sort of metropolis that was, fantastically successful in terms of, being a magnet for wealth. So I would say the other thing is that it took place in May, and usually this would have been March. So now you have this very short gap between Art Basel Hong Kong and Art Basel Basel. So that again, isn't, I don't think, ideal. I mean, we'll see. I believe, it'll be different in Switzerland, because as the Art Basel people have communicated already, that Switzerland has relaxed restrictions regarding COVID. You don't have to show your, vaccination papers. You don't have to be pre-tested to get into the country, et cetera, et cetera. So that should be a little more of a lively playing field. It could be that the Asian Art Basel Hong Kong might resemble now a bit more of what it was like before Art Basel took over that art fair in its previous, iteration, where it was primarily Asian-driven, Asian galleries, and there, it's a wide field.
Well, hopefully this isolation will come to an end soon. It'll be really nice to be able to travel to China, and for Chinese collectors and galleries to be able to more easily travel outside of the country. And, I was joking with someone who's a director at a gallery in the U.S. who was virtually exhibiting at the fair, and by that I mean they had a physical booth at the fair with the art there, but no one from the gallery was there, and they were lamenting that they were going to have to pull an all-nighter from their home to be able to be available to FaceTime with anyone who shows up to their unmanned booth. And that's really not an ideal way to have an art fair and to have significant dialogues with collectors and people visiting the booth. But anyways, on a final note, I did want to ask you about some major changes to auction regulations in New York City. I think they flew under the radar because of the busy May we had in the art world, but what are some of these changes, and how might they significantly impact the auction space and how auctions operate?
I mean, essentially, New York City and the New York City Council, which, governs regulations, across the board, in terms of commerce, in terms of everything. Basically, a week before the auction started, eliminated regulations on auctions. So, you could, it's a laundry list of things, but for instance, you can't, in the past, there were regulations about you can only, say, bid up to and not beyond The reserve price in terms of, what they call chandelier bidding. You had to notify if any lot carried any sort of financial guarantee, either by the auction house or by a third party that had to be designated on the catalog page or, on the screen, and with lots of, glossary and explanations in the back, of course, in small print, but yet you were able to tell that there were X number of lots that were backed by guarantees. And it's I think the whole sort of message, as it was crisply described by a art world attorney here in New York, who was quoted in the New York Times article, and he said, with no regulations, there are no more rules of the road. That was Thomas Danziger. Which is frightfully true. I mean, in terms of whether the auction houses are going to then simply, in New York, just not post that kind of information or start, playing games, more games behind the scene, remains to be seen. In that article, Christie's and spokespeople for both Christie's and Phillips said that they weren't going to change anything and, going into the sales. I mean, we'll see. There wasn't a indication from Sotheby's, but I'd be curious really to know what the message is behind that. From the quite liberal, but perhaps the politicians in local government just don't care about what wealthy people do or how they're protected or if they need to be protected. But I think they do.
Yeah, I read some of the coverage on these changes as well, and two things struck me that I found to be really interesting. First, the auction houses weren't lobbying for these changes. Normally, you would think if all of a sudden a highly regulated industry, or at least a regulated industry, was becoming far less regulated, you'd think the participants in the space were the ones pushing for that change, but that wasn't the case here. So that's really surprising. And second, it appears it was broad sweeping changes in order to remove regulations from small businesses, many which were severely impacted by COVID, and somehow the auction industry fell into that. One change that I recall was that you could now have reserves that were higher than low estimate, which is not something you could do in the past. And so you have that in addition to chandelier bidding above the reserve now being allowed. I mean, there are certain rules that the art world just needs in place to ensure that participants, or most participants at least at auction, actually know what's going on in the sale room. And maybe that's why auction houses announced that they wouldn't be implementing any of these changes, at least in the short term, just because it would cause so much havoc in the auction space. And perhaps because they haven't embraced these changes is why we haven't read about this that much, because I do think there would be an uproar if all of a sudden these changes were being implemented by the auction houses.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of, this was 22 years ago, but there were, that major price fixing trial involving Christie's and Sotheby's that took place in federal district court here over price fixing issues. And as a result, in part, a lot of new regulations were brought to bear on the market. But from my point of view, and probably others, it's not something, eliminating regulations doesn't exactly instill confidence in someone participating in that market.
Exactly. Well, we'll just have to see how all this plays out. Judd, thanks so much again for coming on to the podcast. We really appreciate you helping us break down all of the major art market activities in May. If our listeners don't already, you should definitely check out Judd's writing, which can be found in the Art newspaper or ArtNews, as well as your own website. What's the website again?
Yeah, it's juddtully.net.
Great. Thanks so much again, Judd.
Thanks, Adam.